One group says cow farts are destroying the world. The other side says lab-grown meat is mad science meant to control us. So what's the real truth? We need to separate the science and the opinions and take a closer look at the theories and facts behind the tale of the cow. For years, we've been told that cattle ranching is one of the worst offenders when it comes to climate change, with massive carbon footprints and methane emissions. And then we see these huge industrialized operations with thousands of cows, sometimes under inhumane conditions. And we think, well, that must be cattle ranching. But what if there's a better way based on traditional and natural methods that doesn't just reduce the harm to the planet, but actually heals the environment? And this is where regenerative ranching comes into play. It's a revolutionary new method of cattle ranching that goes beyond sustainability. It works to regenerate the land, boost biodiversity, and even trap carbon from the atmosphere and the soil. And it's not just theoretical. Ranchers from around the world are already using these methods to produce meat and dairy more responsibly. And the results so far haven't just been promising, they're exceptional. We're seeing healthier soils, more resilient ecosystems, and carbon being sequestered on a significant scale. There are other schools of thought as well. Lately, we're hearing a lot about lab-grown meat, and it's getting a lot of headlines as a green alternative to traditional ranching. Its advocates claim it's the future of food production, clean, efficient, and environmentally friendly. But the reality is far more complicated. Lab-grown meat relies on energy-intensive processes, leading to a sizable carbon footprint. Another thing to remember is that lab-grown meat can be patented, meaning whoever controls the patent controls our food supply. Anyone can raise cattle, but lab-grown meat is going to be a high-tech product controlled by a few companies. Now, cows have been branded as major culprits in the climate debate because of their methane emissions. We've all heard about the environmental danger of cow farts. We're going to take a hard look at the science in order to better understand the issue. I want to know if cattle raised in a regenerative system can actually help offset those emissions by promoting a healthier ecosystem. It's time to take an objective look at the issue. Let's cut through all the chatter and the spin so we can finally make some informed choices on the future of our food system.
Hey y'all, I'm Stephen McBee. I'm from North Missouri. I run a family-owned farming and ranching operation where we row crop about 25,000 acres and we run about 2,000 head of cattle, and we also have a small bison herd, small sheep herd. We have been a conventional row crop and cattle operation for the last 10 or 15 years, and we have been in the transition of moving over to regenerative and AMP grazing practices over the last year and a half.
My name is Courtney. I am Mrs. Green Pastures Cattle. My husband and I, we own a ranch called Green Pastures Cattle Co. Started in 2019. He is a fourth generation farmer and I am first generation.
To understand why regenerative ranching is gaining traction, we need to first understand what it actually is. At its core, regenerative ranching is a holistic land management strategy that mimics natural ecosystems. Instead of pushing the land to its limits, regenerative ranching works with nature to restore and rebuild the land and soil by embracing biodiversity and the interactions of multiple species and plants. One of the key methods of regenerative ranching is rotational grazing, also known as adaptive multi-paddock grazing. In traditional ranching, cattle often graze in large, open areas without much movement. This can lead to overgrazing, soil degradation, and compaction. But in rotational grazing, cattle are regularly moved from one small section of pasture to another. This gives the plants time to recover and grow back healthier and stronger. Over time, this method encourages deeper root systems in the plants, which in turn improves soil structure and allow it to store more water and carbon. Land that's normally being farmed for a crop like wheat or corn can be cover cropped for a season. The needs of a nitrogen-hungry crop like corn can deplete the soil, which means a reliance on chemical fertilizers to replace what's lost. However, if you cover crop that field, let grass grow in and work it into your rotational grazing, in just 1 year, the animals can return you a healthy, microbe-rich soil that's full of organic matter. Another critical aspect of regenerative ranching is the integration of different species. In nature, animals don't live in isolation. Regenerative ranching uses a bunch of different kinds of animals like sheep and cattle and chickens. Each species interacts with the land in different ways to improve its overall health. For example, chickens will help break up manure to spread it more evenly, and sheep will trim grasses that cattle won't touch. This multi-species approach increases biodiversity and reduces the risk of disease outbreaks. Soil health is the foundation of regenerative ranching. Healthy soil can sequester carbon, hold water, and support diverse ecosystems. One way to improve soil health is through cover cropping. where different types of plant are grown between grazing periods. These crops help prevent erosion, improve nutrient cycling, and help develop rich, moisture-holding organic soil. And when cattle graze on the nutrient-rich cover crop, it improves their health and creates a feedback loop that benefits both the land and the livestock. The result? Healthier ecosystems, greater biodiversity, and most importantly, more resilient food production systems. By working with nature instead of against it, regenerative ranching offers a path forward for sustainable meat and dairy production. It's not just about sustainability. It's about regenerating the land so future generations can farm and ranch, while ending the practice of deforestation to sustain livestock.
Our row crop side is conventional farm operation, but we do no-till and cover crop. And so whenever we grow those cover crops throughout the fall, we'll actually background those cattle all winter long on the crop stubble and cover crops. And we've noticed an improvement in our crop yields substantially, as well as obviously the cattle thriving off the cover crops.
We have several pastures, and every year we add another pasture to the mix. We rotate them anytime we feel like the grass needs to rest and regrow. And yeah.
When it comes to cattle ranching, a lot of times the conversation revolves around the carbon footprint. But what if I told you properly managed cattle actually help sequester carbon? Pull it right out of the atmosphere and store it in the soil. The concept is simple. Healthy plants, especially grasses, pull carbon dioxide from the atmosphere during photosynthesis. This carbon is stored in the plant's roots, and over time, some of it's transferred into the soil where it can be stored for decades or even centuries. This process, known as carbon sequestration, is a powerful tool in the fight against climate change. Now, let's compare this to conventional feedlot systems. In feedlots, cattle are kept in close, confined spaces and fed a diet of grain. These systems are notorious for their negative environmental impact. In addition to the methane produced by the cattle, feedlots contribute to significant soil erosion, water pollution from waste runoff, and loss of biodiversity. They also rely heavily on fossil fuels to grow, harvest, and transport feed. In contrast, regenerative ranching not only reduces the impact, but actually reverses some of the damage done by conventional farming practices. By improving soil health and increasing biodiversity, regenerative systems make the land more resilient to extreme weather events like droughts and floods. When you have healthy, rich soil that's full of organic matter and natural microbes, it does a much better job of retaining water. And that means it doesn't need nearly as much irrigation. So it's doing a much better job of protecting our natural resources. But unfortunately, regenerative ranching also isn't some kind of magic bullet. It won't just solve all our problems overnight. It also needs proper management in order to be effective. But studies have shown that with the right techniques, regenerative grazing can offset the methane emissions from cattle and even result in a net positive impact on the environment. Regenerative ranching offers a way to produce beef and dairy in a way that actually benefits the environment, sequestering carbon, improving soil health, and restoring ecosystems.
Right now, carbon credits for no-till and cover crops, we actually have a pretty substantial revenue stream, anywhere from $25 to $35 an acre for every acre that we no-till and cover crop. And then these big corporate companies are buying those cover crop or the carbon credits for tax incentives. So UPS, FedEx, Amazon, they're actually coming in and buying these carbon credits to offset their negative carbon output.
Now let's shift gears and talk about lab-grown meat, also known as cultured or cell-based meat. On the surface, lab-grown meat seems like a almost perfect solution to the problems we face with traditional ranching. It doesn't require grazing land, it eliminates emissions from cattle, and the companies who invented it promised it's a more efficient way to produce protein. But is it really as green as it claims to be? One of the biggest problems facing lab-grown meat is the energy consumed in its production. Growing meat in a lab requires highly controlled conditions, including maintaining specific temperatures, sterile environments, and constant monitoring of the cells. This requires a significant amount of energy. Some estimates and studies are showing that lab-grown meat will have higher energy needs than traditional ranching does, especially if we need to rely on non-renewable energy sources. The overall carbon footprint of lab-grown meat is another concern. Now, it may not be producing methane like cattle do, but it is producing a significant amount of carbon. And that's because the amount of energy it takes to produce the lab-grown meat has to come from somewhere. and that somewhere creates carbon emissions. The production facilities themselves also have environmental costs. They require high-tech equipment and specialized materials that aren't always biodegradable or recyclable. Now, building the facilities that it would take to grow the meat is a big problem. Those facilities take a lot of concrete to build, and concrete accounts for 8% of the anthropogenic CO2 in our atmosphere. If you were to scale up a lab-grown system to feed a single nation, much less the entire world, the environmental costs would be startling. You would have the energy needs to run it, the footprint from manufacturing the massive facilities, the fossil fuels and emissions of specialized distribution systems, all of the different expendable resources, and more. At the end of the day, it would actually dwarf the emissions of a traditional ranch full of open green pastures. So that pasture is producing oxygen, it's producing food, it's producing microbe-rich, healthy soil. It's producing a carbon sink where we can sequester our greenhouse gases. Another factor that's really important to consider is the fact that lab-grown meat can be patented, which means it's owned and controlled by a small number of companies. Unlike cattle, which can be raised and bred by anyone, lab-grown meat is a proprietary product. This raises questions about food sovereignty and access. If lab-grown meat becomes the norm, will it be affordable and accessible to everyone? Or will it be controlled by a few corporations that have the ability to price gouge a consumer with no alternative options? It's not like we haven't seen it before. Monsanto's been using their patents on GMOs to destroy generational farms for years. And the message is clear. Either use our product or we'll destroy you. Why should lab-grown meat be any different? We also need to think about the consequences of developing a reliance on lab-grown meat. We need to ask ourselves if we want a food system that requires an energy grid and high-tech infrastructure that's vulnerable to EMPs or solar flares. Can lab-grown meat really be scaled to feed the whole world? Or are we just trading one set of environmental issues for another? I'm not going to say that lab-grown meat is completely devoid of potential because I just don't think that's true. But it's also not the saving grace some people want to make it out to be. When you put it side to side with industrial feedlots, I think it's a pretty close race. But when you try to compare it to regenerative ranching, there's no real contest.
Lab-grown meat, that's not nature. And to create all those facilities, and that's not great for the environment. That's no secret. That should be no secret to anyone.
You know, for anyone that's involved in the farming and ranching industry, obviously the lab-grown meat, you're just like, what the hell is this? I mean, it's not even cultured. I don't want my meat grown in a cultured Petri dish, where it actually is taking more ingredients to make that cultured meat than it is to, you know, raise these animals. It's just insane.
Let's talk about one of the most well-known arguments against cattle farming, methane emissions, also known as cow burps and farts. You've probably seen the headlines. Cow farts are destroying the planet with methane emissions. But how much of that is really true? Yes, cows produce methane, which is much more potent at trapping heat in the atmosphere than greenhouse gases like CO2 are. But what's equally relevant is that methane takes a much shorter time to break down in the atmosphere than CO2 does. Methane can break down in about 10 to 12 years. But CO2, that can take centuries. So what's happening is a trade-off, potency or duration. Methane from cattle is part of a natural biogenic cycle. Grass absorbs carbon dioxide from the air. Cattle eat the grass and release methane. That methane breaks down into carbon dioxide, which is once again absorbed by plants, and the cycle continues. What makes this relevant is that in this cycle, methane isn't introducing new carbon to the atmosphere like burning fossil fuels does. When you're using regenerative ranching techniques, the methane emissions of the cattle can be more than offset by the carbon that's sequestered in the soil. Remember, healthy soils can sequester vast amounts of carbon. Regenerative techniques like rotational grazing encourage plant growth, which creates a deep root system, and that sequesters even more carbon. So when they're properly managed, cattle in a regenerative system actually can have a net positive impact on the environment. The key part of that is management. Proper grazing, improving soil health, and restoring ecosystems. When done right, regenerative ranching doesn't just offset methane emissions, it actively contributes to reducing overall greenhouse gases. So yeah, it's true, cattle produce methane, but it's a lot more nuanced than just saying cow farts are killing the planet. So when I looked at it objectively, cattle can definitely be part of the problem with industrial feedlot systems, but they can also be part of the solution through regenerative ranching. And I think way too often, that's being left out of the conversation.
we're actually doing is we've partnered up with the University of Wyoming to do feed efficiency studies and carbon offset studies on our actual cattle. So essentially, whenever we have our cows feeding in a trough, we have what's set up like a it's a weird, it almost looks like a hood, and it captures all the methane that cow is putting off, and we're actually able to test to see if what we're doing by putting carbon back into the ground, sequestering that carbon, is offsetting what the cows are emitting, to where we can actually have a certified net carbon zero or carbon negative cow. And that's what we're able to find.
The next important question is, which kind of milk is better, almond or dairy? Almond milk's been marketed as the eco-friendly choice. Does it live up to the hype? Now, I thought almond milk was the better, more sustainable option, but then I started doing some research. Almonds are one of the thirstiest crops out there. To grow a single almond, it takes a whopping gallon of water. That's just one almond. And it takes a lot of almonds to make even a quart of almond milk. To produce 1 quart of almond milk, you're looking at about 100 gallons of water. Another problem is where the almonds come from. Most almonds come from California, which is a state that's been hit hard by drought. So that water is coming from regions that are already struggling to manage their limited resources. And there's another aspect of it I don't love. In a lot of cases, growing almonds makes heavy use of pesticides. And that's causing another water issue for us, contamination. When pesticides run off into lakes, rivers, and groundwaters, they pollute freshwater ecosystems, harming aquatic life and reducing water quality. These chemicals can also disrupt soil health by killing beneficial microorganisms, leading to long-term damage to soil fertility and its ability to sequester carbon. Pesticides can also cause harm to non-target species like pollinators such as bees and butterflies. Over time, the use of pesticides can lead to resistant insects, which means the need for even heavier chemicals. And so we continue the cycle of environmental degradation. Now let's take a look at dairy farming. Cows do use a lot of water. Holsteins are the primary dairy cow in the industry. A lactating Holstein cow drinks 15 to 20 gallons of water a day. For that, they'll produce 9 gallons of milk per day. By comparison, it takes 3,600 gallons of water to produce the same amount of almond milk. Another advantage is that cows graze on lands that aren't suitable for growing crops. They can convert inedible grasses into a nutrient-rich food source. Almond farming relies heavily on water-scarce regions, but dairy farming can take place in areas where water use isn't as big of an issue. This is also where the potential downside comes in. If cows are fed on corn and grain, it significantly increases the water usage because you have to account for the water being used to grow the crops as well. But on the upside, our dairy cows can take advantage of the same rotational grazing patterns that we talked about with our regenerative ranching earlier. Grass-fed has slightly more cholesterol and sodium, and grain-fed has slightly more potassium, but otherwise they're pretty similar in calories. It is harder to get dairy cows all of the amino acids and proteins they need from grass feeding alone. Natural supplements like molasses and others can be used to make up the difference. The cows provide more than milk too. They give us fertilizer, which helps grow crops, especially when compared with the water-intensive monoculture of almond farming. When I look at the big picture, it seems like dairy farming is the more responsible choice, especially when you go with ethical and regenerative practices. And it might not be worth mentioning, but I bet almonds are really hard to milk. Regenerative ranching also has its challenges. One of the biggest challenges for ranchers trying to adopt these practices is the initial cost and learning curve. The transition from traditional to regenerative ranching takes an investment of both time and money. Farmers need to learn new techniques, invest in fencing for rotational grazing, and possibly reduce the number of animals they're raising in the short term to allow the land to recover. There's also the issue of scalability. While regenerative ranching has been shown to work on small to mid-sized farms, there's an ongoing debate whether or not it can be scaled up to meet global demand. Regenerative ranching requires more land per animal than feedlot systems, which means to raise the same amount of beef or dairy, you might need double or even triple the amount of land. This could lead to land use conflicts, or the conversion of wild habitat into grazing lands, which could undermine the environmental aspect of the regenerative process. Finally, there's the market challenge. While demand for sustainably produced meat and dairy is growing, it's still a niche market compared to the industrial produced food that dominates supermarket shelves. For regenerative ranching to become more widespread, consumers need to be educated about these practices and be willing to support them with their purchases. Additionally, policy changes and financial incentives may be needed to help more farmers make the change to regenerative ranching. Despite these challenges, the potential benefits of regenerative ranching, both for the environment and the long-term sustainability of our food system, make it an important piece in the fight against climate change.
Really, it's a little bit more labor intensive. You're moving your cows multiple times a day, so you're using micro pastures and you're moving them through. You can do some things to automate that with automatic gate buckles that drop during set times, but a little bit more labor intensive. And then that 2 to 3 year transitionary period where you're just taking on the learning curve. I've always said, we're involved with multiple businesses, and every time you add something new into your business portfolio, you're paying that learning curve for 2 to 3 years before you even know what you're doing. It's the same thing with regenerative ranching. And so hey, for 2 to 3 years, I'm going to be taking my whippings nonstop on this, but if I can make it through and survive that transitionary period, there is a lot of light at the end of the tunnel if you can make it through. There's such a connection to the land and the animals when you're eating meat that is raised on a family farm or raised in a regenerative way. To me, that's such a connection that goes deeper than just surface level of getting your protein in from the meat source.
As we've explored today, regenerative ranching offers a hopeful path forward for meat and dairy production. By working with nature rather than against it, regenerative ranchers are able to produce food that's not only sustainable, but also actively improves the health of the land and the ecosystems that support it. So what can you do? Support local regenerative farms. Many farmers are already using these practices, and by choosing to buy grass-fed, pasture-raised meat and dairy, you're helping to create a market for more sustainable food. Together we can create a food system that not only feeds us, but helps heal the planet. This is Matthew Gauger from Greenhorn Grove, reminding you to look at the big picture, take a lesson from nature, and always remember, he who controls the food controls the world. Be blessed. If you found this video helpful, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest in sustainable food production. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.